Hello again, Dan Alasso here with History for Today. And I've reached the point in my historiography class where I'm preparing to talk about social history. At first, I was thinking that I would lecture about the rise of the discipline out of the New Left in America and in Britain, talking about people like E.P. Thompson, and having my students read his 1967 article called Time, Work Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism, just because it is such a great article. I'm still planning on doing that, but I think I'm going to expand my scope and talk a bit about how Howard Zinn took the idea of history from below out of kind of a purely academic setting and wrote what may be the most read history book of the 20th century, A People's History of the United States. I am planning on talking about Zinn later on in the semester when I talk about public history and more popular history writing. But I think this might be a time to kind of begin mentioning him. It's extremely difficult, though, to get an accurate sense of the popularity and the impact of A People's History based on searching the web. And this surprised me a bit, but I suspect that this fact reflects the ways that Zinn's book continues to uncover both the problems with what we typically think of as patriotic retellings of the American story, and also his very detailed descriptions of the struggles of regular people to improve both their individual and their collective situations through group actions like unions and civil rights organizations and popular mass movements. These are not necessarily the lessons that the powerful want us to learn from history. Lessons like that our leaders often lead us astray, and that regular people have a role and have been effective in the past returning society to a better path. As a result of what I believe is kind of ongoing resistance to Zinn's message, its popularity seems to be being actively downplayed by online authorities. A website that I found that actually calls itself bookauthority.org describes itself as a service that, quote, identifies and rates the best books in the world based on the recommendations of thought leaders and experts. Who, you might ask, are these thought leaders and experts? The top 5 who are pictured on the homepage are Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, Satya Nadella, Bill Gates, and Marcellus Wiley. So 4 tech CEOs and 1 NFL defensive end. Nothing against Mr. Wiley, but is he the most prominent black thought leader that they could find? Book Authority's top 10 books in their 100 best-selling history books of all time, along with their estimates of the sales of these books, go like this. Number 1, Sapiens by Yuval Harari, which they say has sold 2 million plus. Second, The Diary of Anne Frank, 1 million plus. Third, The Civil War by Shelby Foote, 1 million plus. Fourth, The History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, 500,000 plus. Fifth, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford, 500,000 plus. Sixth, A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, 500,000 plus. 7, Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates, 500,000 plus. 8, Undaunted Courage, Stephen E. Ambrose, 500,000 plus. 9, Homo Deus by Yuval Harari again, 200,000 plus. And 10, The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter, 200,000 plus. This is a very weird list of history books. I'm not sure that I would really call at least a third of them primarily histories. I think they're in the wrong genre. I haven't read them all, so I'm not going to offer my opinions about their relative merits or their ranks in terms of content. But in terms of book sales, I strongly suspect that Anne Frank's diary has sold way more than 1 million copies. But again, I don't really think of it as primarily a history. According to the 2015 introduction to the new reprint of A People's History, written by Zinn's collaborator Anthony Arnove, it has sold over 2.6 million copies in its first 35 years in print, and it shows no sign of letting up. So that probably validates my claim and makes it more credible that A People's History is probably the most read history book of the 20th century. Other online sources are equally unreliable as this self-proclaimed book authority. A Forbes magazine history of the best history books of all time actually includes Becoming by Michelle Obama. Really? Of course, that list was compiled by an expert named Gene Marks, whose bio says, "I write about public policy and tech that impacts my small business." Definitely the sort of guy that Forbes should have turned to for this type of a list. But in addition to this type of idiocy, there also seems to be an ongoing conservative effort to combat Zinn's legacy. As recently as May 2019, the Wall Street Journal published a weekend editorial and interview feature titled "Reclaiming History from Howard Zinn." It complains about Zinn's anti-American perspective and the continuing popularity of his book and of the zinnedproject.org, which the journal seems to regard as a subversive force that needs to be actively opposed. So in light of all of this, I think that I may begin focusing a little bit more attention and effort at continuing this dialogue about the ideas that Zinn brought to light in his book. To do that, I'm going to look at a chapter of Zinn's book each week and talk a bit about what he covers, how it challenged the traditional histories, and how people have reacted to that challenge in the last 35 years. I'll begin today with a couple of words about the introduction that I mentioned that Arnove wrote for the 2015 edition. I think Arnove is accurate when he begins by saying Howard Zinn fundamentally changed the way that millions of people think about history. And I think this was not only because he challenged the patriotic master narrative, but also because Zinn looked at what he called the past's fugitive moments of compassion rather than just its solid centuries of warfare. Arnove says that in his experience, Zinn's writing led me to see history as something that we are all part of making together, and to realize that how we understand our past informs not only how we see the present with all its complexity, but also how we might imagine a different future. And of course, this resonates a lot with me. I did, after all, name my channel and my website History for Today. I also think it's kind of interesting that I graduated from high school the year A People's History came out, and Ronald Reagan was elected president that year. I think it's interesting that in a New York Times book review, Eric Foner called attention to the fact that Zinn was really, in Foner's words, the first historian to attempt to survey all of American history from the perspective of the new scholarship. Foner was another of these early American social historians in the late 60s, early 70s. And he wrote several monographs that looked at particular periods, such as Reconstruction, through this new perspective. But he's probably right that Zinn was the first to try to tell the entire story of America from the bottom up. And certainly Zinn was the first to write this way for a popular audience. Foner also said in his review that he thought that the tone of Zinn's book, in his word, reflects a deeply pessimistic vision of the American experience. Foner admitted that Zinn included vivid descriptions of events that are usually ignored. But he didn't really offer a solution as to how these events could be described without the tone shifting away from the celebration that is usually typical in patriotic histories. Arnove maybe gives a solution to this. He mentions that Zinn himself not only respected the people who resisted, but found a joy in the effort itself. He had an appreciation, Arnove says, of the bonds of solidarity, mutual affection, and creative expression that participation in such movements produced. I think this is a really crucial element, and maybe something that is missing in too many depictions of resistance struggles. Arnove later mentions cultural theorist Raymond Williams's idea of resources of hope. It seems like this is the positivity that we can find in these past struggles against inequity, the energy of this hopefulness. And we can also find them in Zinn's insistence on telling their stories. So I'm going to begin covering a chapter a week of a people's history in a video like this. I'll probably also cover the primary sources in the companion volume called Voices of a People's History of the United States. And then maybe I'll move on to some material from the more recent and indigenous people's history of the United States, which I recently picked up. But that's all for now. So I hope people found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for listening, and I will see you again